good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are, what day it is. Hi, so welcome to Shaolin Monks for Jesus. And today's talk is on Darwin, religion, and scientism. So let's get the theme music rolling. All right, thank you. That's Zion I Trippin'. So let me get up the images that we're going to be working with a little bit today. So in terms of Darwin, religion, and scientism, kind of scoping it out a little bit, Trump and the Republican Party represent two kinds of highly hypocritical Christian values. Each in their own right. Trump, the opportunist, profiteer, and Republican Party, I guess, much the same, along with their fundamentalists who are basically profiteering corporate props. Now, on the other hand, there is the high integrity social justice movement of secular NGOs like Greenpeace and Oxfam. Except that they have also origins that are more explicitly about their actual Christian nature. With Sojourners having an excellent slogan that social justice is a Christian tradition, not a liberal agenda. Another angle I like to mention is how Max Ohlschlager, a philosopher in Texas, I believe, at a university in Texas, wrote a book a few decades ago now about how religion is extremely important, and he argues that because of the environmental crisis, that the inability of the secular world and scientific mentality to overcome the problems involved, especially the corporate profiteering and propagandistic model in mainstream culture. Therefore, religion is an important approach to the environmental crisis. So that brings us to the whole issue of science versus religion. What is it all about? And I just want to refer briefly to Stephen Jay Gould's expression from some decades ago now about non-overlapping magisteria, that science and religion are separate phenomena. Although the non-overlapping is a particular modifier, is a particular quality, and there certainly are overlapping areas. But more, Stephen Jay Gould used in that case papal terminology from a papal document for some reason. I mean, it's quite an interesting term, quite a nice term, magisteria. But more academically, I don't know why he didn't refer to the more academic terms, though I haven't been able to read his book specifically. So. But I simply have not been seeing really much clarity about this subject in the research I've been able to do here, admittedly far from the United States at the moment, where I live now in Brazil. But the issue is of epistemology and knowledge domains. Fritjof Capra seems to be one of the clearest thinkers I know about this kind of thing. And he's working with general systems theory. And I've also been coming upon and learning more about social epistemology, or seeing really how it simply is the term that confirms what I've been getting into. Also the educational discipline has some active use of this kind of terminology. And so that beyond science and religion, we also have the contrast between science and the social sciences and humanities to clarify this kind of issue. So now, getting to Darwin specifically, who was Darwin? Darwin was raised as a Unitarian. Let's see here. We've got some images of Darwin to look at. Right, here's Darwin as a child. Nice image coming up. And where is it? Okay, here we go. So let's give Lenovo a hand. The computer worked a little bit. Can you see that? No, it's not quite clear, is it? Really insert these things, right? Do a little editing. Okay, we're going to get it. We'll get there. Hopefully one of these days. So there's a little image of Darwin. Let's see, I'm moving right along. Right, Darwin and one of his kids. Okay, another thinker. So coming back to the general picture there. So Darwin was raised as a Unitarian in general. And so where is this image of Joseph Priestley? Right over here. I'm going to bring him up. Right, so Joseph Priestley was influenced apparently by the Unitarian movement coming from Eastern Europe. And full disclosure, as an interfaith Christian, I am a registered Unitarian Universalist, and really love their interfaith association, kind of post-Christian or really implicitly Christian. And I am an explicit Christian Unitarian Universalist, or rather something like that. That's for another session. Now, Priestley originally himself, let's look at him briefly, I'd like to do that, was a Calvinist, and he couldn't reconcile it with his perceptions of things, and so got into universal salvation, and eventually wrote a 1782 book, which I have a copy of here, which offended scientists and Christians alike, because it was using science and Christianity in ways that offended both, or many conventional practitioners and thinkers in those areas. And he used ideas like divine providential materialism and necessitarianism, which I want to think about further and I think sound very fascinating. But that's all I'll say about Joseph Priestley at this point. Now getting to Darwin, he had some concerns about damnation in his thinking about religion, particularly in terms of his family, his father and his brother and some friends who weren't believers in Christ apparently, and the condemnation of damnation that is spoken of in some verses in the Bible. But that may have come actually later, because as he was preparing to go, in fact on the Beagle, he was in fact preparing to be a parson, a minister, in town. Excuse me, look at that, my Portuguese is slipping into my English now. He did some reading of William Paley's work. Let's see, I've got an image here of William Paley. William Paley. There's an image of William Paley then, still a parson naturalist, I believe, certainly a theological thinker, thinking about scientific issues, and so he was talking about the designer, the intelligent design of nature, and how that really governed reality. He talked about the blind watchmaker. He used the blind watchmaker analogy and metaphor to understand God as this removed creator. His beliefs kind of correspond to Darwin observing things like parasitic wasps in nature, which raised questions to him about the goodness of God. So, and finally then, at some point, Darwin communicated to one of Ernst Haeckel's, right, the German biologist who invented the term ecology. Ernst Haeckel's students, he commented, Darwin did, that Christ has no presence in science that he could see, except maybe in terms of being cautious about evidence. Right? And that's basically a quote from the internet, now, then also Darwin seems to have been around at some point there, having done some studies to some degree of intensity of cultural development and the question of, is religion innate? And so he came to the conclusion that monotheistic religion is not an innate instinct, and that it is the result of a lot of cultural development, historical and cultural development, and so that is one aspect of it, then in terms of his considering of Christ, I'm going to be getting to the idea that, well, who exactly did Darwin consult, and did Darwin make a comprehensive kind of social analysis and cultural analysis of the relevance, psychosocial and cultural analysis, really, of the relevance of Christ to science, addressing the components, the historical issues, and so on. For example, we can make the simple observation, we can deal with the terminology, right? When we're talking about science, Darwin makes that comment in reference to evidence, being cautious about evidence. Well, we know that the conduct of science involves much broader issues, and fundamentally is philosophy. Science is scientific philosophy. That's, I know, itself kind of a controversial statement according to modern ideologies. Modern scientism, scientistic kind of ideologies, secularistic ideologies. But that's what science is. Science involves a method and a practice, and that is what feeds into the empirical nature of, the kind of empirical nature of scientific philosophy. Then that method is used in hypothesizing and reasoning about information, about experimental data, and so on. And where did that come from? That was developed by Christians like Galileo and Newton and Descartes with, and I put it here, the phrase, God through Jesus on the brain in the history of science. Now, some simple references kind of at the more superficial level because of the complexities involved if we get deeper. But basically, Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation was this basic historical event that freed up Northern Europe from Catholic domination, and the universities in the north with it, and of course the scientists there. Galileo being that critical kind of landmark after Luther, actually, but someone who distinguishes, who helps function as a kind of a landmark, an identifying marker of the difference, right? Because then we have Kepler, Newton, Huygens, Descartes, and Darwin as famous scientists coming after. But in terms of Christian, particularly Christian events, we have St. Thomas of Aquinas, right, a monk at the University of Paris, and his accomplishments, establishing, identifying the areas, the knowledge domains of law, of lawful study, that is, where laws were at work, could be identified to be at work. The natural, the human, the divine, and the scriptural. And then going back even further in history, to the beginning of the monks, right? It is in fact significant that Martin Luther and St. Thomas of Aquinas were both monks. Yeah, educated monks at universities or the like, or similar institutions. So St. Anthony of the Desert, being one of his names, is the father of Christian monks. He's given that nickname, that title of honor. And then St. Pachomius came along, and then the whole tradition of Christian monasticism in the West got started and got developed following their pioneering efforts and important distinctions in their practice. So now we come up and we can look at the role of Christianity in the lives of the famous scientists, and understand it really looking at the psychosocial and cultural components at work in the details of their lives. Newton, Hooke, and Ed Haley are three characters who had interaction around the gravitational work of Newton in the 1670s and 80s. So in a little bit of a soap opera that really, basically, some of the details came from, to me, from Cosmos, the new episodes with the, what's that guy's name? You know, that new astronomer guy who wasn't Carl Sagan. You know, great guy in his own right, to be fair, of course. And so these details in Newton's life, you know, he was offended by Hooke, who was jealous of the whole subject of gravity, and Newton took offense and didn't work on his gravity for some 5 years. And then along came Ed Haley, this friendly guy, sociable, high social intelligence, emotional intelligence, and he started, you know, with and equally interested in science, and with a scientific question for Newton, and got, as his friend, on a friendly basis, got Newton going again on the gravitational question, and finally ended up supporting him in getting it published, right? So this kind of this kind of social interaction and psychosocial interaction, or interaction with psychosocial components, that is highly identifiable as Christian in its nature, in its flexibility, dynamic, in its flexibility and other resilience and subtleties and nuances of dynamics that we can trace back, for example, to St. Augustine's Confessions, right? I remember very clearly how his Confessions is a landmark work in terms of his self-esteem and his sense of identity, and his ability to communicate about his identity and his experiences and reflecting upon them, right? St. Augustine of Hippo. So, and that can be contrasted with Julian James's work from the Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, right, which is kind of a secularistic work, reductionistic, but of a related nature, right, in terms of understanding the psychosocial and cultural components involved in Jesus Christ's legacy in modern Western civilization, Christian civilization, secularized Christian in the end. Now, an additional, besides St. Augustine of Hippo in the year 430, there's George Fox and his non-university visions and reflections, who is somebody I'd like to bring up at some point here in more detail if possible, because of the fact that he was virtually a contemporary of Newton, John Locke, and Christian Huygens, and really getting into Hugo Grotius and Tom Hobbes, and engaged in healing and in high integrity, initiated and founded his high integrity denomination, the Quaker Friends. An extremely important event with huge ramifications, huge consequences for the perpetuation of high integrity Christian culture. These are some examples, and by Darwin's time, he raises the question: why didn't Darwin mention George Fox and the Quaker Friends? Apparently, he didn't know much about them. Joseph Priestley, also, right, a materialist, and where's the consideration of George Fox's example? Even in Jefferson, who relied a lot on Priestley, very specifically and explicitly. There is no reference to George Fox, who very distinctly, definitely, by having at least 4 stories on the internet that I was able to find, demonstrated this psycho-spiritual healing phenomenon that is attributed to the New Testament that so many people of that era had trouble with, and so many people still today, in their mechanistic mentality and their paradigm, still have trouble with. Now, Darwin himself, I'd like to just look at who he was a little bit more and the situation with him. Darwin married his cousin Emma Wedgwood, right? They were so from the creme de la creme of English society, and from the liberal side, the quite progressive side in the upper crust. So he married her in 1839, and they were hobnobbing with Unitarians in particular, right? Emma was quite a dedicated Unitarian Christian. I understand that at their church, the local down parish church where they attended, which was an Anglican church, they actually, even though it was nonconformist, I understand, she would turn her back when the Anglican kind of creed was read. So interesting dynamics going on there, despite her being quite a little bit more conventional in terms of her grasp of Christianity to some degree. But that I have to research a lot more. But there we go. So now in terms of Darwin's question and statement, really, that Christ, he didn't know, or he didn't think Christ had relevance to science. Now, there's some interesting examples in his life of how he demonstrated this, what really is a moderate form, really mild form, but we can really focus on a microscope in on it to blow it up, to really get at the seriousness of the issue, to help really examine and get a grasp of what this issue of the knowledge domains is all about, and why, how a scientist can improve their conscientiousness about that, among others. For example, Richard Owen, right? Richard Owen was this other scientist, a biologist at his time, quite hugely prominent. He invented the word dinosaur, right? An anatomist, more oriented towards anatomy. He nevertheless himself was contributing some ideas about pre-evolutionary thought. However, his psychosocial condition, his state of mind and psychology made him jealous. It left him jealous and afraid of religious conservatives. And so he became hateful of Darwin. He hated Darwin and his successful evolutionary idea, and his defenders, and Darwin's defenders. And in his actions, eventually Darwin came to hate Owen. And so right there is this hate dynamic, and if we remember the fact that Christ is not defined by doctrines, not even the damnation doctrines that that turned Darwin off so strongly, that he taught basically, of course, obvious to many I think, the Good Samaritan package, the Lord's Prayer package, the love thy neighbor as thyself, as Jesus did, until thy enemy, and God first of all, right? So, and in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And however that gets broken down into gradations and emotional qualities and processes. Then there's the language situation. Darwin speculated that language was evolved from animal sounds. And he had been observed by Max Muller, a linguist, this giant linguist at the time, who was very involved in Sanskrit studies and evaluating the emerging understanding of Indo-European language development and the relationship between European languages and Indian languages. Max Muller was so sort of disturbed, a little bit disturbed or bothered by Darwin's relatively simplistic pursuit of the question, and that he sent him a number of his lectures. And so Darwin, instead of understanding kind of the transitionary process, kind of appears to have been stuck on the mere idea of reductionistic kind of idea of animal sounds. And just to state here that, because then the next jump would be involving the tool use kind of capacity, right? That's how the complexity of language then can be understood. A.R. Wallace, right? Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin showed in his behavior with Wallace a lot of gentlemanly, very Christian, high integrity Christian kind of behavior in his respectful and decent behavior with Wallace around the whole biology and evolutionary situation. Except when it came to evaluating higher mental faculties, that question, which gets to this idea of language that we just mentioned. Whereas Wallace got into the idea of spirit in the question, Darwin reduced his ideas in reductionistic fashion to sexual selection. How did higher mental faculties evolve? Well, just sexual selection. What about the whole issue, again, of tool use and the cognitive relationship to tool use and the complexity issue, the ability of tool using cognition to then be applied in a variety of areas. The examples already at his time would include what? Building pyramids and cathedrals. There were already extreme developments before pre-scientific, pre-modern scientific developments in terms of complexity that demonstrate that kind of intellectual development. And Darwin simply didn't draw on other specialists. In philosophy we can see it, right? You can see the whole sequence in, John Locke was Newton's contemporary. Newton and just the history of science, if we evaluate that, right? You could say Descartes, Kepler, the evaluation of the information, besides the earlier examples of pyramids and cathedrals and so on. So, there you have it. Darwin, religion, and scientism. Let me know what you think. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll just keep it going. Shaolin monks for Jesus. Getting at that truth to help us love Jesus and love the pluralistic legacy that is modern Western culture. With Buddha and with Lao Tzu and even Islam and all of that good stuff being our final objective. Okay, so God bless you, God bless us, and we'll see you next time. Take care, bye-bye.